Richard Montgomery had spent 2 decades convincing himself that true power meant never needing anyone beneath him, ruling his billion-dollar empire from a glass tower high above the city, certain that money, influence, and a name everyone feared to disappoint were enough to keep his world unshakable. So when a single catastrophic night ripped through everything he'd built, reducing his legendary company to a mess of failing systems, frozen accounts, and panicked calls from investors, leaving him teetering on the edge of bankruptcy with his reputation in shreds, it felt almost like a bad joke that the only person who stepped forward with an offer of help was someone he'd barely registered as more than background scenery, his cleaning lady's quiet, sharp-eyed daughter. Later, he would remember the exact way she'd stood in his ruined penthouse, laptop tucked under one arm, voice calm as she asked whether she could at least take a look at his crashed systems, and he would wince at the way he'd scoffed. Because in that moment, Richard Montgomery truly believed that a community college student could not possibly see anything that his imported experts, overpaid consultants, and hand-picked IT directors had missed. What he could not know, and what would soon matter more than all his arrogance combined, was that the young woman standing in front of him occupied a very specific, very dangerous intersection of knowledge and motive. The girl he had just dismissed as the Maid's kid was about to become either the man's salvation or the final nail in his coffin, and she was, in a twist of irony he would not appreciate until much later, the only person alive with the skills and access to uncover that the betrayal which destroyed him had been coded, deployed, and carefully hidden by someone sitting inside his own boardroom. Just before we get back into Richard's fall from the top, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this one about power, downfall, and redemption, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. On the night everything began to unravel, Richard stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, 63 stories above the city that had turned his name into a synonym for ruthless success, watching his own reflection stare back at him. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, silver hair swept into place, a heavy crystal glass of bourbon resting in one hand, looking every inch the untouchable king he believed himself to be. Far below, traffic moved like veins of light through the darkened streets. Tiny figures disappeared into subway stations and late-night cafes, and he felt that familiar thrill of knowing that while those people worried about rent and fuel prices, he could move a fingertip across a screen and shift markets on 3 continents. The illusion of total control shattered with something as small and ordinary as a knock. His IT director, David Harper, appeared in the doorway clutching a tablet so tightly his knuckles had gone pale, beads of sweat standing out along his hairline despite the office's carefully regulated climate. Richard barely turned, irritation tightening his jaw, and asked if the interruption was worth dragging him away from the final preparations for the Westbrook merger, a deal that would almost double the valuation of Montgomery Innovations overnight. Harper swallowed, explained that the new AI investment algorithm, Richard's proudest creation, and the centerpiece of tomorrow's announcement, was showing irregular network activity, patterns that looked disturbingly like the early stages of a breach, and suggested with the hesitant courage of a man who liked his job that they should run a full system diagnostic before pushing any live transactions through it. Richard, who had learned long ago that showing doubt in front of subordinates was as good as bleeding in shark-infested water, set his glass down with a measured click and cut him off with a cold, amused question. Did Harper really expect him to halt the biggest launch of the decade because some log file looked a bit unusual? He reminded the IT director that Montgomery Innovations had the most sophisticated encryption architecture in the industry, that every line of code had been audited and stress-tested by teams Harper himself had hired, and that he, Richard, had not clawed his way from a cramped one-room apartment to a tower of steel and glass by jumping at every shadow that flickered on a screen. With a dismissive wave, he ordered Harper to stop chasing ghosts and focus instead on ensuring the presentation ran flawlessly, the servers stayed online, and the investors saw exactly what they were paying for. Hours later, with the building nearly empty, the cleaning crew already gone, and only the soft hum of air conditioning and distant elevators for company, Richard sat alone at his desk, reviewing final projections while the city glowed below like a circuit board. The quiet felt reassuring. This was the part of the night he loved, when the world seemed to narrow down to himself, the numbers on his screen, and the sense that he alone was awake at the level where decisions really mattered. He was scanning a forecast for post-merger revenue when his monitor flickered once, then again, as if something had tugged on the power. He frowned, tapped a few keys, and watched in growing irritation as the display went black for a heartbeat before exploding back to life in a flood of red system alerts. Error messages cascaded down the screen faster than he could parse them, databases timing out, access failures stacking over core process warnings, until the entire interface looked like it was bleeding. At the same moment, his phone began to vibrate across the desk with such violent urgency that the call almost answered itself when he snatched it up. David Harper's voice came through ragged and too loud, fighting the noise of some chaos happening on his end, telling Richard that they had a situation, that the main servers were crashing, not just one cluster, but every system tied to the AI environment going down in a domino chain they could not seem to stop. Richard demanded clarification, demanded to know what all of them meant, and Harper, sounding older by 10 years than he had that afternoon, explained that a dormant backdoor program of unknown origin had just activated inside their core, that it was issuing commands through legitimate channels as if it were a trusted administrator, and that every attempt to shut it down was being deflected or rejected because the malicious code was piggybacking on the company's own security protocols. By the time the elevator doors slid open on the server floor, Richard stepped into a scene that looked nothing like the calm, redundant, meticulously ordered infrastructure he paid a fortune to maintain. Emergency lighting bathed the room in a sickly amber glow. Several racks were half shut down, one of them venting a thin, bitter ribbon of smoke, and clusters of engineers hunched over terminals muttering frantically to one another as lines of corrupted code scrolled by faster than any human could read. At the center of it stood Harper, barking commands that weren't producing any meaningful result, his tablet filled with diagnostics that all said the same terrible thing. Someone had embedded a timed kill switch inside Montgomery Innovation's brightest star, and now that switch had flipped, the AI was not only devouring itself but dragging the rest of the company's systems into oblivion with it. Every time we close one door, another opens. Harper pulled up a screen showing lines of code racing past. And sir, there's more. They're not just destroying data, they're copying it. Richard felt the floor shift beneath him. Copying it where? We don't know yet. But your entire algorithm, every investor file, every proprietary system we've developed, it's all being transmitted somewhere. By the time we trace it, they'll have everything. The night stretched into dawn as Richard watched his empire dismantle itself. By 6 in the morning, the damage was catastrophic. Servers had physically burned out from the overload. Critical data was corrupted beyond recovery. And worst of all, competitors were already receiving anonymous packages containing Montgomery Innovation's most guarded secrets. The media arrived before breakfast. Richard stood in his office watching news vans multiply like bacteria outside his building. His phone rang constantly, investors, board members, journalists, all demanding answers he didn't have. His assistant hovered nervously by the door, clutching messages she didn't dare deliver. Mr. Montgomery, the board is demanding an emergency meeting. They're saying she stopped swallowing hard. Saying what? They're saying you need to resign. The meeting was a massacre. Richard sat at the head of the table. He'd commanded for 15 years, facing men he'd mentored, promoted, and trusted. Their faces were cold, calculating. They'd already made their decision. Preston Hale spoke first, tall, polished, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He'd been Richard's partner since the early days. Richard, we all respect what you've built here. But the fact is, this breach happened on your watch. Investors are pulling out. Our stock has dropped 40% since midnight. We need decisive action. Decisive action. Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. Or a scapegoat. Don't make this personal, another board member interjected. This is about protecting the company I built, the company that just lost billions, Preston said smoothly. Richard, we're offering you a generous severance package. Take it. Walk away with your dignity intact." Richard looked around the table, seeing the truth in their eyes. They weren't offering him anything. They were taking everything. And if I refuse, Preston's smile widened. Then we vote, and I think we both know how that will go. The vote was unanimous, 12-1. Even the men Richard had personally recruited raised their hands against him. Security was already waiting outside the boardroom. "You'll need to surrender your access cards and company devices," Preston said, standing. "We'll have your personal effects sent to your residence." Richard rose slowly, his movements precise despite the rage burning through his veins. He looked at Preston for a long moment, memorizing the satisfaction in the man's eyes. "You planned this. I saved this company from your negligence." Preston gestured to the guards. "Gentlemen, please escort Mr. Montgomery from the building." The walk to the elevator was the longest of Richard's life. Employees he'd never bothered to learn the names of watched him pass, some with pity, others with barely concealed satisfaction. The security guards flanked him like he was a criminal. When the elevator doors closed, shutting out the whispers and stares, Richard finally allowed himself to breathe. Outside, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed in his face, microphones thrust toward him like weapons. "Mr. Montgomery, how does it feel to lose everything? Is it true you ignored security warnings? Will you face criminal charges?" Richard pushed through them without a word, climbing into the back of his town car. The driver, bless him, didn't ask questions. They pulled away from Montgomery Innovations, formerly Montgomery Innovations, in silence. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum. Richard walked through rooms that had once hosted senators and celebrities, now echoing with emptiness. His wife had left 6 months ago, tired of being married to a ghost. His son was gone even longer than that, a loss he'd buried under work and ambition. Now, with nothing to distract him, the silence was deafening. He heard the vacuum before he saw her. Amara Williams had been cleaning his penthouse for 3 years. She was a quiet woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and steady hands. She never asked personal questions, never gossiped, and never expected more than a polite nod. Richard had barely registered her existence beyond ensuring her checks cleared. Now she appeared in the doorway with a cup of tea on a small tray. "Mr. Montgomery, I thought you might need this." Richard looked at the tea, then at her. For the first time, he really saw her. The gentle concern in her face, the careful way she set the cup down, the dignity in her simple uniform. "Thank you, Amara." She nodded, turning to leave, then hesitated. "Sir, if you don't mind me saying, I'm sorry about what happened. It's not right what they did to you." Something in Richard's chest cracked just slightly. "I appreciate that. My daughter, she's good with computers, studies all that technical stuff at community college." Amara smiled softly. "She's always talking about systems and codes and things I don't understand, if you ever need help with that sort of thing." Richard almost laughed. Help from a community college student, from a cleaning woman's daughter. But he caught himself swallowing the bitter response. "That's kind of you to offer." Amara left him alone with his tea and his thoughts. Richard didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his home office, staring at financial statements that told a story of complete ruin. The lawsuit from investors would drain whatever assets remained. His accounts were frozen pending investigation. His reputation was destroyed. The next morning, a courier delivered the final blow. A foreclosure notice was, Passy stamped an official giving him 30 days to vacate the premises. Richard held the paper in his hands, reading it 3 times before the words finally registered. Bankrupt, homeless, finished. He heard Amara's voice in the kitchen speaking quietly on her phone. "No, baby. I know it sounds bad, but he's a good man deep down. He's just lost right now. I don't know what he's going to do. I worry about him being all alone in this big place. Yes, I'll be careful. Love you too." That evening, Richard sat in his darkened living room with a bottle of scotch, watching the city lights blur together. His laptop sat open on the coffee table, the screen blank and mocking. He tried to access his old files, his backup systems, anything that might salvage some piece of his empire. Everything was locked, deleted, or corrupted beyond recognition. He didn't hear her approach. "Mr. Montgomery." Richard turned to find a young woman standing in the archway. She was maybe 20, with intelligent eyes and natural hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, and carried a laptop bag over her shoulder. This had to be Amara's daughter. "My mom's worried about you," she said simply. "Asked me to stop by on my way home from class." Richard turned back to his empty screen. "I'm fine." "With respect, sir, you don't look fine." She moved closer, glancing at his laptop. "Is that the system that crashed?" "What's left of it?" There was a pause. Then softly, "Mr. Montgomery, maybe I can take a look." The words hit him like a slap. He almost laughed. This girl, this child who probably learned coding from YouTube videos, thought she could solve problems that his team of experts couldn't. But when he turned to dismiss her, he saw something in her expression that stopped him. Not arrogance, not pity, just quiet confidence. "I don't think you'll be of much help," he said. But the words came out weaker than he intended. She didn't flinch. "Maybe not, but it can't hurt to try, right?" Richard stared at her for a long moment, then gestured at the chair beside him. "Knock yourself out." The next morning, Amara arrived early, her own key jingling in the lock. She'd been doing this for years, arriving before Richard woke to prepare his coffee and tidy the spaces he'd disturbed during the night. But today she found him in the living room, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups with her daughter hunched over a laptop beside him. "Zuri, baby, what are you doing here?" Zuri looked up, her eyes red from staring at screens all night. "Mom, you have to see this. Someone didn't just hack Mr. Montgomery's system. They sabotaged it from the inside. Look at these code fragments. They're deliberate. Someone wanted it to fail." Richard, equally exhausted, pointed at the screen. "Your daughter is either a genius or a miracle worker. I can't decide which." Amara moved closer, anxiety and pride wearing on her face. "Zuri, you have class this morning." "Mom, this is more important." Zuri pulled up another window, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "See this signature here? It's embedded in the malware. Whoever did this left their mark, probably thinking no one would find it. But if I can trace it back..." Richard interrupted her, his voice sharp with old habits. "That's not how corporate security works. You can't just trace code like it's a phone number." Zuri didn't even look at him. "Actually, sir, you can. Every programmer has patterns, little habits in how they write code. It's like handwriting. If I can pull enough samples, I can build a profile. That would take weeks or a few hours if you stop interrupting me." Amara inhaled sharply at her daughter's boldness. But Richard fell silent. He watched Zuri work, her confidence both irritating and fascinating. She moved through his system like she'd built it herself, finding paths he'd never known existed. "There," she said finally, pointing at a string of numbers. "This access point was created 4 months ago. Whoever did this had HIL clearance. They weren't some external hacker. This was someone inside your company." Richard leaned forward. "Can you tell who?" "Not yet, but I can tell you when they logged in, what files they accessed, and when they planted the malware." She pulled up a calendar overlay. "Look at the pattern. Every Friday night around 11 p.m., always the same terminal." "That's Preston's office," Richard breathed. "His private terminal." "Preston, hail." Zuri glanced at him. "Your business, partner. Former partner." Richard's mind raced, pieces falling into place. Preston's eagerness to remove him from the board, the speed at which everything had been prepared, the vote that seemed orchestrated before Richard even arrived. "He set me up." Zuri nodded slowly. "It looks that way, but proving it is going to be harder. This code is sophisticated." "He covered his tracks well, but not perfectly," Richard said, something like hope stirring in his chest for the first time in days. "You found his signature. That means there's more to find." "Maybe." Zuri sat back, rubbing her eyes. "But Mr. Montgomery, this isn't just about finding evidence. If Preston has your algorithm, he's probably already using it. By the time we expose him, he could have built an entire empire on your technology." The words stung, because they were true. Richard stood, pacing the length of the room. "Then we need to move fast. Can you keep digging?" Zuri hesitated, glancing at her mother. Amara's face was tight with worry. "Baby, maybe you should let the professionals handle this." "Mom, I am a professional. Just because I don't have a fancy degree yet doesn't mean I don't know what I'm doing. It's not about what you know, it's about being safe. These are powerful people, which is exactly why someone needs to stand up to them." Zuri turned to Richard. "Sir, I'll help you, but I need access to your old mainframe, the one at the company headquarters. If Preston left any trace of his plan, it'll be there. Richard shook his head. They've locked me out of everything. I can't even get past the front desk. A small smile crossed Zoor's face. Good thing my mom still has her service entrance key. Then that night, the three of them stood in the alley behind Montgomery Innovations. The building loomed above them, glass and steel reflecting the streetlights. Security cameras swept the main entrances, but the service door used by cleaning crews and maintenance workers was dark and quiet. Amara's hands shook as she unlocked the door. If we get caught, we won't, Zuri whispered. Mom, you know this building better than anyone. Can you get us to the server room without being seen? Amara nodded reluctantly, leading them through a maze of service corridor. They passed storage rooms and break areas, climbing stairs meant for staff who weren't important, enough for the main elevators. Richard followed in silence, humbled by how much of his own building he'd never bothered to see. The server room was cold and loud, filled with the hum of machines that had survived the crash. Zuri immediately set to work, connecting her laptop to a terminal in the corner. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, commands flowing faster than Richard could follow. Okay, I'm in, she murmured. Their security is good, but they're not expecting an attack from inside the building. Richard stood watch by the door, while Amara hovered protectively near her daughter. Minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an hour. Somewhere above them, footsteps echoed through the corridors. Zuri! Richard hissed. We need to move faster! Almost there! Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold. Just need to. Yes. She pulled up a file directory, her eyes widening. Mr. Montgomery, look at this. Project Falcon. And it has Preston's access signature all over it. Richard moved closer, reading over her shoulder. The files detailed everything. The planned sabotage, the timeline of the breach, even transcripts of Preston's communications with competitors. It was all there, documented with the kind of arrogance that came from assuming you'd never be caught. Can you copy it? Zuri was already downloading. Copying to 3 different encrypted drives. This is it, Mr. Montgomery. This is the proof you need. The footsteps above them grew louder. A door opened somewhere close by. Richard grabbed Zuri's arm. How much longer? 30 seconds. The footsteps were right outside now. A radio crackled. Security to server room showing an unauthorized access on Terminal 7. 20 seconds. The door handle turned. Done. Zuri yanked her laptop free, shoving it into her bag. Amara pulled her daughter toward a back exit Richard hadn't even noticed. They ran through the corridors, Amara leading them through a path she'd walked 1,000 times before. Behind them, shouts echoed and radios squawked. They burst out into the alley just as security flooded the server room. Richard's heart hammered as they walked quickly toward Amara's old sedan parked a block away. They didn't run. Running would draw attention. They just moved with purpose. 3 people who had every reason to be walking these streets at night. Only when they were safely inside the car, pulling away from the building, did Richard allow himself to breathe. In the back seat, Zuri clutched her laptop like a lifeline, a grin spreading across her face. That was insane, she whispered. Amara gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Don't you ever make me do something like that again. But even as she scolded, Richard saw the hint of a smile on her face. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd found the evidence that could change everything. Richard looked at Zuri through the rearview mirror. When you said you knew about computer stuff, you undersold yourself. She met his eyes. People usually underestimate me, Mr. Montgomery. I'm used to it. The words carried weight, and Richard felt shame settle in his chest. How many people had he underestimated over the years? How many brilliant minds had he dismissed because they didn't fit his narrow definition of worth? I won't make that mistake again, he said quietly. Zuri nodded, turning her attention back to her laptop. As Amara drove them through the sleeping city, Richard watched the building that had been his entire world fade into the distance. For the first time since the crash, he didn't feel like a man who'd lost everything. He felt like a man who might just win it back. After their narrow escape from Montgomery Innovations, Richard found himself in unfamiliar territory. Amara's modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood far from the glass towers of his former life. The living room had become their makeshift operations center with Zuri's laptop and scattered papers covering every available surface. Richard sat on the worn couch watching Zuri decrypt files with the kind of focused intensity he once reserved for boardroom negotiations. Amara moved quietly in the kitchen, preparing coffee for the long night ahead. The apartment smelled of vanilla candles and home cooking, such a stark contrast to his sterile penthouse that Richard felt disoriented. "Mr. Montgomery, you need to see this," Zuri said, pulling up a document on her screen. Richard moved beside her, reading the encrypted communications she'd uncovered. They were emails between Preston and 3 other board members discussing the takeover months before the crash. The conspiracy went deeper than he'd imagined. "They planned everything," Zuri said quietly. "The breach was just the trigger. They'd been positioning themselves to take control for almost a year." Richard's jaw tightened. "Preston was always ambitious. I thought I was mentoring him. Turns out I was just convenient. There's more." Zuri opened another file. "He's been communicating with your competitors. He sold them pieces of your algorithm even before the crash. He wasn't just stealing your company, he was selling you out piece by piece." The betrayal cut deeper than Richard expected. Preston had been at his wedding. He'd held Richard's son when he was born. They'd built something together, or so Richard had believed. Now he saw the truth. Preston had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and Richard's arrogance had given him the perfect opening. "Can we use this in court?" Richard asked. "Maybe, but we need more than just emails. We need to show the direct connection between Preston's access and the sabotage code." Zuri scrolled through lines of programming. "The problem is he used proxy servers and routed everything through multiple locations. It's like trying to follow footprints through a rainstorm." Amara appeared with 3 mugs of coffee, setting them down carefully. "Zuri, baby, you've been staring at that screen for 6 hours. You need rest." "Mom, I'm fine." "No, your mother's right," Richard said, surprising himself. "We all need to step back and think clearly. Exhaustion leads to mistakes." Zuri looked at him with raised eyebrows. "Is this the same man who used to work 30-hour stretches?" "That man lost everything," Richard said softly. "I'm trying to be smarter this time." They took a break, sitting around Amara's small dining table with coffee and leftover casserole. She insisted Richard eat. The domesticity of it all felt strange. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sat at someone's kitchen table sharing a simple meal without business being discussed. "Mr. Montgomery," Amara said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, why did you build it?" "The company, I mean. What were you trying to prove?" Richard stared into his coffee, the question hitting harder than expected. "I grew up with nothing. My father was a janitor. My mother cleaned houses." He stopped realizing what he just said. He looked at Amara, seeing her differently. "I spent my whole life trying to get as far from that as possible. I thought success meant distance from where I started. And now," Amara asked gently, "now I'm sitting in your kitchen eating casserole and realizing that the person who worked the hardest to destroy me came from privilege, while the people helping me rebuild are the ones I spent years overlooking." Richard met her eyes. "I'm sorry, Amara, for every time I didn't see you, for every time I treated you like furniture instead of a person." Amara reached across the table, patting his hand. "We all have our journeys, Mr. Montgomery. What matters is where we end up, not where we've been." Zuri watched the exchange quietly, something softening in her expression. She'd been prepared to dislike this man, to help him out of obligation to her mother. But seeing his humility, his genuine remorse, it changed things. "Okay," she said, pushing back from the table. "I think I know how to trace Preston's connection, but it's going to require accessing the backup servers at the company, the ones they don't think anyone knows about." Richard frowned. "There are no backup servers. Everything was centralized. That you knew about." Zuri smiled slightly. "But every IT director worth anything keeps secret backups. I'd bet money your guy Harper has emergency servers somewhere off-site. If we can find them, we can trace every action Preston took without him knowing we're looking." "How do we find them?" we asked Harper. Richard shook his head. "He won't help. He works for Preston now, does he?" Zuri pulled up Harper's employee file on her laptop, because according to this, he submitted his resignation 2 days after you were removed. He never officially left, but he stopped showing up. That doesn't sound like someone happy with the new management. The next morning, they tracked David Harper to a small coffee shop downtown. He sat alone in the corner, looking like he hadn't slept in days. When Richard approached, Harper's head snapped up, fear and guilt wearing on his face. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm not here to blame you, Harper," Richard said, sitting down uninvited. "I'm here because I need your help." Harper glanced around nervously. "I can't be seen talking to you. Preston made it very clear what happens to people who cross him. Did he threaten you?" Harper's silence was answer enough. Zuri slid into the seat beside Richard. "Mr. Harper, do you have backup servers? Somewhere Preston doesn't know about." Harper stared at her, confused. "Who are you?" "Someone trying to fix the mess your boss made," Zuri said bluntly. "Those backups could have evidence Preston can't erase. We need access to them." Harper's hands shook around his coffee cup. "If I help you and Preston finds out, I'm finished. Not just my career. He'll make sure I never work in tech again. And if you don't help us, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing you let a criminal get away with destroying a company and ruining innocent lives," Richard said quietly. "I ignored your warnings, Harper. That's on me. But you have a chance now to do the right thing. Don't let fear stop you." Harper was silent for a long moment, then pulled out a piece of paper and scribbled an address. "There's a storage facility in Newark, Unit 247. The servers are there, but they're encrypted. You'll need this code to access them." He wrote a string of numbers below the address. "Thank you," Richard said sincerely. "I should have done more," Harper whispered. "When I saw the code being planted, I should have fought harder to make you listen. We both made mistakes," Richard acknowledged. "Let's make sure they count for something." The storage facility was a gray concrete building in an industrial area, the kind of place people stored things they wanted to forget. Richard, Zuri, and Amara found Unit 247 at the back of the third floor. Inside, surrounded by dusty boxes and old furniture, sat 3 server towers, humming quietly in the darkness. Zuri immediately got to work, her laptop connecting to the first server with practiced ease. "This is it. This is everything. Every email, every access log, every line of code that touched your system in the last 2 years. Can you prove Preston planted the malware?" Richard asked. "Give me time." Zur's fingers flew across the keyboard. "I need to cross-reference the timestamps with the malware signature and match them to Preston's access patterns. It's like building a puzzle from 1,000 pieces." Hours passed. Amara brought sandwiches from a deli down the street. Richard paced the small space, feeling useless as Zuri worked her magic. He'd spent his whole life being the smartest person in the room, the one with all the answers. Now he was completely dependent on a 20-year-old who'd taught herself coding from library books and online courses. "Got it," Zuri said suddenly, her voice tight with excitement. "Mr. Montgomery, look at this." On her screen was a complete timeline of Preston's actions. Every access point, every file modification, every communication with outside parties. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Preston had systematically dismantled Montgomery Innovations from the inside, sold its secrets to competitors, and orchestrated Richard's downfall with surgical precision. "This is admissible in court?" Richard asked. "It should be. These are official company servers with time-stamped logs. As long as we can prove these servers are legitimate backups, this evidence will hold up." Richard felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Real, tangible hope that justice might actually be possible. He looked at Zuri, this remarkable young woman who'd seen past his failures to help him anyway, and felt humility wash over him. "Zuri," he said carefully, "when this is over, when we've exposed Preston and cleared my name, I want to rebuild, but not the same company. Something better. Something that actually matters." He paused, choosing his words. "I want you to be my partner. Equal partner. Not an employee, not an assistant. A full partner in whatever we build next." Zuri stared at him, disbelief written across her face. "Mr. Montgomery, I haven't even finished my degree. You don't need a degree. You need vision and integrity, and you have both." Richard glanced at Amara, who watched her daughter with tears in her eyes. "I spent my whole life believing success meant corner offices and expensive suits. I was wrong. Success means building something that matters with people who actually give a damn. Will you help me do that?" Zuri looked at her mother. Amara nodded, smiling through her tears. Baby, this is your decision, but whatever you choose, I'm proud of you. I don't trust the corporate world, Zuri said honestly. I've seen what it does to people. Then help me build one that deserves your trust, Richard said. No boardrooms full of sharks, no cutting corners or crushing competition, just honest innovation with people who care about making things better. If I'm going to rebuild, I want to do it right this time. Zuri extended her hand. Equal partners. That means equal say in all decisions. Richard shook her hand firmly. Equal partners. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked from Amara's apartment, refining the evidence and preparing their case. Richard reached out to a lawyer he'd known for years, someone who'd left corporate law to work in civil rights because, as she put it, I wanted to sleep at night. Jennifer Walsh listened to their story with growing anger. Preston Hale did all this. I always knew he was ambitious. But this is criminal. Can we win? Richard asked with this evidence. Absolutely. But Richard, you need to prepare yourself. This will be ugly. Preston will fight back with everything he has. He'll try to destroy your credibility, question your mental state, and drag your name through the mud all over again. Let him try, Richard said quietly. I've got nothing left to lose. Actually, you do. Jennifer looked at Zuri. He'll come after you too. He'll claim you hacked the servers, that you planted evidence, that you're some delusional hacker trying to extort money. It won't be pretty. Zuri lifted her chin. I can handle it. I hope so, Jennifer said seriously, because once we file this lawsuit, there's no going back. They filed the next day. The media eruption was immediate and overwhelming. Disgraced CEO claims conspiracy. Montgomery fights back against former partner. Tech industry rocked by sabotage allegations. Preston held a press conference within hours, standing before cameras with the wounded dignity of the falsely accused. These allegations are completely baseless. Richard Montgomery is a desperate man trying to blame others for his own failures. I'm confident the courts will see through this pathetic attempt at revenge. But behind the scenes, Preston was panicking. His lawyers filed motion after motion trying to suppress the evidence, claiming the servers were illegally accessed. They argued that Zuri had no authority to retrieve company data, that Richard's access had been revoked, that everything they presented was inadmissible. They're scared, Jennifer said during a strategy meeting. When people are innocent, they welcome evidence. When they're guilty, they try to bury it. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Richard and Zuri began rebuilding in the only way that made sense, from the ground up. They started small, reaching out to former Montgomery Innovations employees who'd been laid off when Preston took over. We can't pay much right now, Richard told a room full of talented engineers and developers. Actually, we can't pay anything. But what I can offer is equity in something new, something built on integrity instead of ego. If you believe in second chances for this company, and for me, then help us build something worth believing in. To his surprise, most of them stayed. They worked from Amara's apartment, then from a rented garage space when they ran out of room. Zuri led the technical development while Richard handled the business side. But this time, he listened more than he talked. He learned names. He remembered birthdays. He brought coffee and cleaned up after meetings. Amara watched it all with quiet pride, seeing her daughter command respect from people twice her age, watching Richard transform from an arrogant executive into someone who understood that leadership meant service, not authority. You're doing good, baby, she told Zuri one night as they cleaned up after everyone left. I'm terrified, Zuri admitted. What if I'm not smart enough? What if I fail everyone who believed in me? Then you'll learn and try again, Amara said simply. That's what your grandmother always told me. Success isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up. The algorithm they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of the aggressive predictive modeling Richard had pushed before, designed to maximize profits at any cost, this version emphasized ethical investment patterns. It flagged companies engaged in worker exploitation or environmental destruction. It prioritized long-term sustainability over short-term gains. This isn't what investors want, one of the developers pointed out. They want maximum returns, not moral lectures. Then we'll find different investors, Richard said. People who understand that sustainable success means considering more than just quarterly profits. The first investor who believed them was a small nonprofit focused on ethical business practices. They provided $50,000 in seed funding, barely enough to keep the lights on, but it was a start. Then a tech blogger wrote about their project, praising the innovative approach to algorithmic ethics. The article went viral, and suddenly they had attention they couldn't have bought. More investors called. Small ones at first, then mid-sized venture capital firms. Intrigued by the ethical angle, Richard turned down anyone whose values didn't align with their mission. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done, walking away from money because it came with strings attached. But Zuri wouldn't compromise, and he'd learned to trust her judgment. "You're building something real this time," Jennifer told him during one of their strategy sessions. "The old Montgomery Innovations was impressive, but it was hollow. This has substance." "I have Zuri to thank for that," Richard said. "She refuses to cut corners." "She learned that from her mother," Jennifer observed. "Amara's been doing honest work in a dishonest world her whole life. That kind of integrity doesn't come from privilege. It comes from principle." 3 weeks before the trial, Preston made his move. One of Richard's new investors received an anonymous email claiming Zuri had a criminal record for hacking. Another got a doctored photo supposedly showing Richard paying off witnesses. The smear campaign was sophisticated and relentless. "He's trying to destroy us before we even get to court," Zuri said, staring at the fabricated evidence circulating online. "Can we fight it?" Richard asked. "We can try, but rumors spread faster than truth." Zuri's fingers tightened around her phone. "He's calling me a criminal, Mr. Montgomery. People are saying I seduced you, that I'm using my mother's position to extort you. The things they're saying about my family." Her voice broke, and Amara immediately wrapped her arms around her daughter. Richard felt rage burn through him, not for himself, but for this young woman who'd sacrificed her peace to help him, and was now being torn apart by people who'd never built anything but lies. "We go on record," he said firmly. "All of us. We tell the truth completely and publicly. We show them exactly who we are and what we're building. If Preston wants to fight dirty, fine, but we're going to fight with truth." They held their own press conference the next day. No prepared statements, no media handlers, just Richard, Zuri, and Amara sitting at a borrowed table in their garage workspace, surrounded by the computers and cables of their startup. "My name is Richard Montgomery," he began, looking directly into the cameras. 6 weeks ago, I was removed from my own company after a cyber attack destroyed everything I'd built. The easy thing would have been to give up, to accept that I'd lost and move on. But 2 people, Amara Williams and her daughter Zuri, showed me another path. He gestured to Zuri. This young woman, who I initially dismissed and underestimated, proved to be smarter and more capable than any executive I ever hired. She uncovered evidence of deliberate sabotage, traced it back to my former partner, and did it all without breaking a single law. Now, because she had the courage to stand up for what's right, she's being attacked by people who want to silence the truth. Zuri spoke next, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a student who happens to be good with computers. When I saw someone in pain, I tried to help, that's all. My mother taught me that we help people when they're down, regardless of who they are or what they have. I didn't help Mr. Montgomery for money or recognition. I helped him because it was right." Amara had the final word, speaking with the quiet dignity of someone who'd spent a lifetime being overlooked. "I've cleaned houses and offices for 25 years. I've seen how powerful people treat those they consider beneath them. But I've also seen that power and wealth don't make you better than anyone else. What makes you better is how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from it. Richard Montgomery is learning that lesson. My daughter has always known it, and that's why we're standing here together." The press conference went viral within hours. Social media exploded with support, with people sharing their own stories of being underestimated or dismissed. The narrative shifted from disgraced CEO strikes back to unlikely alliance fights corruption. Investment offers poured in, real ones this time from people who believed in what they were building. Within a week, they had enough funding to move out of the garage and into actual office space. Nothing fancy, just a renovated community center in a neighborhood that needed revitalization, but it was theirs. Built on honesty and hard work, Richard stood in the empty space on move-in day, watching Zuri direct the installation of their servers, while Amara organized the kitchen area they'd insisted on including. This felt different from his old empire. Smaller, yes, humbler, but infinitely more meaningful. "What are you going to call it?" Amara asked, appearing beside him with 2 cups of coffee. Richard smiled, watching her daughter command respect from the technicians twice her age. "I was thinking Amara Technologies, after the woman who taught me that real strength doesn't come from corner offices. It comes from showing up with integrity every single day." Amara's eyes filled with tears. "Richard, you don't have to." "I want to," he said sincerely. "You gave me a place to land when I fell. You shared your home, your daughter's brilliance, and your time without asking for anything in return. The least I can do is make sure everyone knows where this company's heart really came from." "Then it should be Amara Technologies," Zuri said, joining them. "But Mom, you're on the board. Equal say with me and Mr. Montgomery." "Baby, I don't know anything about running a tech company." "No," Richard agreed, "but you know about running an ethical one. You know about treating people with dignity and leading with compassion. That's what we need most." Amara looked between them, overwhelmed and proud in equal measure. "Then I guess we better make sure this company lives up to its name." As they stood together in their new space, watching the sun set through the windows, Richard felt something he'd lost years ago. Purpose. Not the hollow satisfaction of accumulating wealth, but the deep fulfillment of building something that mattered with people who genuinely cared. The trial was coming. Preston would fight with everything he had. But standing here in this modest office with these remarkable women, Richard finally understood what real power looked like. It looked like a cleaning woman's dignity, a young coder's brilliance, and a humbled billionaire learning that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what actually matters. The morning of the trial arrived with unseasonable cold, as if the city itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Richard stood before the mirror in his hotel room, adjusting a tie he'd borrowed from one of his former employees. His penthouse had been seized weeks ago, and he'd been living in a modest extended-stay hotel near the courthouse. The man staring back at him looked different, leaner, older, but somehow more present than the billionaire who'd once commanded boardrooms. Zuri knocked softly on his door. "Mr. Montgomery, the car's here." They rode to the courthouse in silence. Richard, Zuri, Amara, and Jennifer Walsh. Outside, reporters had already gathered in thick clusters, cameras ready to capture every moment. The media had turned this trial into a spectacle, framing it as David versus Goliath, though Richard wasn't sure which role he was supposed to play anymore. "Remember," Jennifer said as they approached the courthouse steps, "stay calm, answer only what's asked, and trust the evidence. Preston's team will try to rattle you. Don't let them." The courthouse hallway buzzed with anticipation. Richard spotted Preston immediately standing near the entrance to the courtroom, surrounded by his legal team like a general with his lieutenants. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, his expression radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having faced real consequences. Their eyes met across the corridor. Preston smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Then his gaze shifted to Zuri, and something darker flickered across his face. Richard felt protective anger surge through him, but Amara's hand on his arm steadied him. "Don't give him what he wants," she whispered. "We win by staying true to who we are." The courtroom was packed, every seat in the gallery filled with journalists, former employees, investors, and curious onlookers who'd followed the story through social media. Judge Catherine Morrison entered, her gray hair pulled back severely, her expression unreadable. She was known for running a tight courtroom and suffering no foolishness from either side. "All rise," the bailiff called. The trial began with opening statements. Preston's lead attorney, Marcus Blackwell, stood with practiced grace. He was exactly the kind of lawyer Richard had once hired, expensive, polished, and ruthless. "Your Honor, what we have here is a simple case of professional jealousy and delusion," Blackwell began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Richard Montgomery built a successful company, then watched it crumble due to his own negligence and poor judgment. Rather than accept responsibility, he's concocted an elaborate conspiracy theory, dragging innocent people into his vendetta. My client, Preston Hale, has done nothing but try to save Montgomery Innovations from complete destruction. For his efforts, he's been falsely accused and publicly slandered. Blackwell gestured dismissively toward their table. The plaintiffs will present evidence they claim proves sabotage. But this evidence was obtained through questionable means by an untrained college student with no credentials, no authority, and no understanding of proper investigative procedures. This isn't a case about corporate conspiracy. It's about a fallen executive trying to blame everyone but himself. Jennifer stood for their opening statement, her posture straight and voice clear. Your Honor, over the next few days, we will prove beyond doubt that Preston Hale engaged in a systematic, premeditated campaign to destroy Montgomery Innovations and steal its proprietary technology. We will show you time-stamped evidence, documented communications, and technical proof that Mr. Hale deliberately planted malware in company systems, leaked confidential information to competitors, and orchestrated Mr. Montgomery's removal from the company he built. She walked toward the jury box, making eye contact with each member. You will hear testimony from a young woman named Zori Williams, who had the skill and courage to uncover what trained professionals missed. You'll see evidence that Mr. Hale tried to bury, and you'll understand that this case isn't about revenge or jealousy. It's about holding powerful people accountable when they abuse the trust placed in them. The first day consisted of technical testimony, IT experts explaining server logs, security protocols, and the timeline of the system breach. Richard watched Preston throughout, noting how his former partner maintained perfect composure, occasionally whispering to his attorneys with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. Day 2 brought witnesses. Former Montgomery Innovations employees testified about Preston's behavior in the months leading up to the crash, his unusual interest in security protocols, late-night access to restricted systems, and the meetings he held without Richard's knowledge. Mr. Hale was always ambitious, testified Sarah Mitchell, a former project manager. But after Mr. Montgomery announced the new AI algorithm, Preston's whole demeanor changed. He started making comments about how Richard didn't appreciate the team's contributions, how he took all the credit. He was planting seeds, making us question our loyalty. On cross-examination, Blackwell tore into her testimony. Miss Mitchell, isn't it true you were fired from Montgomery Innovations for poor performance? I was laid off when Preston took over along with 40 other people. Laid off or fired? Semantics aside, you have reason to resent Mr. Hale, don't you? I resent being used as a pawn in his scheme to steal a company. The exchange continued, brutal and precise. Blackwell was good at his job, twisting every testimony to cast doubt. By the afternoon recess, Richard could see the strain on their witnesses' faces. This was exactly what Preston's team wanted to exhaust them, to make them question their own memories and motives. They're trying to wear us down, Zuri observed during the break, make everyone too tired to fight back. Then we don't let them, Richard said firmly. Tomorrow you testify. You show them what real strength looks like. That night, Preston's team made their move. Richard returned to his hotel to find an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single photograph, Zuri leaving a bar near campus, the image deliberately composed to look compromising. With it came a note, typed on plain paper. Withdraw your case or everyone learns about your employees' interesting extracurriculars. Richard's hands shook with rage. He immediately called Jennifer, who arrived within 30 minutes along with Zuri and Amara. It's fake, Zuri said after examining the photo. That's not even me. The face is wrong. The proportions are off. They photoshopped someone else's body with a picture of my face. Can you prove it? Jennifer asked. Easily. But that's not the point, is it? Zuri looked at Richard with surprising calm. They're trying to scare us. Make us withdraw because they know we're winning. They threatened you, Richard said, his voice tight. They're going after you personally, and we're going to use it against them, Jennifer said, taking the envelope carefully. This is evidence of witness intimidation, attempted blackmail. We take this to Judge Morrison first thing in the morning. But Amara was quiet, her face pale with worry. Baby, maybe we should think about this. These people are dangerous. Mom, if we back down now, they win. They'll keep doing this to other people and no one will ever stand up to them because everyone's too scared. Zuri took her mother's hands. I know you're worried, but you taught me to do what's right, even when it's hard. This is hard, but it's right. Amara pulled her daughter close, tears sliding down her cheeks. I know. I just wish the world wasn't so cruel to people who try to do good. The next morning, Jennifer presented the threatening envelope to Judge Morrison in chambers with both legal teams present. The judge's expression darkened as she examined the evidence. Mr. Blackwell, she said coldly, does your client know anything about this? Absolutely not, Your Honor. This is clearly the work of some overzealous supporter, not Save It. Judge Morrison cut him off. I'm giving you until end of business today to find out where this came from. If I discover anyone associated with your team had anything to do with this, I will hold them in contempt and refer the matter for criminal prosecution. Are we clear? Yes, Your Honor. And let me be perfectly clear to everyone in this room. Any further attempts to intimidate witnesses will result in immediate sanctions. This is a court of law, not a schoolyard. We will conduct ourselves accordingly. When Zuri took the stand later that morning, the courtroom was electric with tension. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, no makeup except what Amara had insisted on to help with the camera lights. She looked young but composed, her hands steady as she swore the oath. Jennifer began with gentle questions, establishing Zuri's background and expertise. Ms. Williams, can you tell the court about your education in computer science? I'm currently in my third year at community college studying computer systems and cybersecurity. I've also completed several advanced online certifications in network security and forensic analysis. And what sparked your interest in this field? Zuri smiled slightly. When I was 15, my mom's bank account was hacked. We lost $300 we couldn't afford to lose. I taught myself enough about computer systems to trace the hacker and report them to the FBI. We got our money back and I got hooked on understanding how digital systems work. Can you describe your involvement in this case? My mother works as a housekeeper for Mr. Montgomery. After his company collapsed, she was worried about him. She asked if I could look at his computer system, see if there was anything salvageable. When I started examining the code, I realized the crash wasn't accidental. It was deliberately engineered. Jennifer walked her through the technical details, how she'd identified the malware signature, traced the access points, and built a timeline of Preston's actions. Zuri explained each step clearly, using language that even non-technical jury members could understand. She was patient, thorough, and unshakable. Then Blackwell stood for cross-examination. Ms. Williams, he began, his tone dripping with condescension. You're 20 years old, is that correct? Yes. You attend community college, not a prestigious university like MIT or Stanford. That's correct. In fact, you couldn't afford to attend a 4-year university, could you? Jennifer shot to her feet. Objection. Relevance. Your Honor, I'm establishing the witness's credentials. Overruled. But make your point quickly, Mr. Blackwell. Blackwell smiled. Ms. Williams, isn't it true that you have no formal degree, no professional certifications from recognized institutions, and no actual work experience in cybersecurity? I have certifications from several online certifications, self-paced courses anyone can take. Not exactly the same as a degree from a real university, is it? Zuri's expression didn't change. Some of the best programmers in the world are self-taught. Credentials don't determine skill. Results do. Results? Blackwell laughed. You're testifying about highly complex corporate systems based on training you got from internet videos. Tell me, Ms. Williams, who's paying you to testify today? No one. I'm not being paid. Really? Because you're now listed as a partner in Mr. Montgomery's new company, aren't you? Amara Technologies. That sounds like payment to me. I'm a partner because I helped build the company, not because I testified. How convenient. Blackwell paced before the witness stand. Let's talk about how you obtained this evidence. You accessed company servers without authorization, didn't you? I accessed backup servers with information from the former IT director. Backup servers that were company property. Property you had no legal right to access. The company was stolen from its rightful owner through illegal means. I was helping recover evidence of that theft. That's not for you to decide, Miss Williams. You're not a lawyer. You're not a judge. And you're certainly not law enforcement. You're just a girl playing hacker breaking into secure systems. Because you thought you were smarter than everyone else? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Morrison banged her gavel. Mr. Blackwell, watch your tone. But Blackwell pressed on. Your mother cleans Mr. Montgomery's home, correct? She must have been devastated when her employer lost everything. Did she convince you to help? Perhaps even suggest there might be financial rewards if you could somehow prove a conspiracy. Zuri's composure finally cracked, not with anger, but with something more powerful, absolute certainty. My mother is the most honest person I know. She taught me that character isn't about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you do when no one will ever know. She's spent her entire life doing honest work for people who never even learned her name. So, no, Mr. Blackwell, she didn't convince me to lie. She taught me to tell the truth, even when it's inconvenient. That's what I'm doing now. The courtroom fell silent. Even Blackwell seemed momentarily thrown. Zuri continued, her voice steady and clear. You're right that I'm young. You're right that I don't have fancy degrees or impressive credentials, but I know code the way some people know music or art. I can see patterns where others see noise. And what I saw in Montgomery Innovation System was clear, deliberate sabotage, with Preston Hale's fingerprints all over it. You can question my credentials all you want, but you can't change what the evidence shows. I have no further questions, Blackwell said stiffly, returning to his seat. Jennifer stood for redirect. Ms. Williams, can you explain to the jury what a digital signature is? It's like a fingerprint left in code. Every programmer has habits, ways they structure commands, comments they leave, shortcuts they prefer. These patterns are as unique as handwriting. And you found Preston Hale's digital signature in the malware that destroyed Montgomery Innovations. Not just found it, I found it dozens of times across multiple files, all time-stamped to periods when Mr. Hale had exclusive access to the systems. The probability of someone else mimicking his exact programming style at the exact times he was logged in approaches zero. Jennifer displayed the evidence on screens throughout the courtroom. Lines of code with highlighted sections showing identical patterns across different files. Can you explain what we're seeing? These are 3 different pieces of malware planted at different times. Notice how they all use the same variable naming conventions, the same commenting style, and the same unusual approach to error handling. This isn't coincidence. This is one person's work repeated across months. The jury leaned forward, studying the screens. Even those without technical knowledge could see the patterns, the repetition, the deliberate consistency. Thank you, Miss Williams. No further questions. As Zuri stepped down from the witness stand, she walked past Preston's table. He stared at her with undisguised hatred, his mask of confidence finally slipping. Zuri met his gaze without flinching, then took her seat beside Richard. You were magnificent, Richard whispered. I just told the truth, she whispered back. The trial continued for 3 more days. Expert witnesses confirmed Zuri's analysis. The FBI agent who'd examined the backup servers testified that the evidence was authentic and properly preserved. Preston's own employees described his increasingly erratic behavior after the crash, including one assistant who testified about seeing Preston delete files and wipe hard drives in a panic. When Preston took the stand, Jennifer methodically dismantled his testimony. Every explanation he gave contradicted documented evidence. Every alibi fell apart under scrutiny. He claimed the access logs were falsified, but couldn't explain how. He suggested Richard had planted evidence, but had no proof. By the time he stepped down, even his own lawyers looked uncertain. The closing arguments were brief. Jennifer presented a clear timeline of Preston's conspiracy, backed by irrefutable evidence. Blackwell tried to cast doubt, arguing reasonable explanations for every piece of evidence, but his arguments felt hollow against the weight of proof. Judge Morrison instructed the jury and sent them to deliberate. 24 hours later, they returned. Have you reached a verdict? The judge asked. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of corporate sabotage, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of theft of proprietary information? Guilty. On the charge of fraud? Guilty. The courtroom exploded with noise. Preston went pale, gripping the table as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. His lawyers immediately began calling for appeals, but Judge Morrison silenced them with her gavel. Mr. Hale, this court finds you guilty on all counts. Sentencing will be scheduled for 3 weeks from today. In the meantime, you will surrender your passport and remain under electronic monitoring." She turned to Richard. "Mr. Montgomery, the court also rules in your favor on all civil claims. Full ownership of the algorithm and associated intellectual property is restored to you, along with compensatory damages in the amount of." Richard stood, interrupting the judge. "Your Honor, if I may." Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Montgomery, I don't want the money. I want it donated to scholarships for students from underprivileged backgrounds pursuing technology degrees. Students like Zori Williams who have the talent, but not the means." The judge smiled, the first genuine smile Richard had seen from her. "A noble gesture, Mr. Montgomery." "The court approves. Is there anything else?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to request that Miss Zuri Williams be officially recognized as co-creator of the algorithm. Her contributions to its development and recovery should be part of the legal record." "Granted, Ms. Williams, congratulations on your official recognition." As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed them with questions, but Richard only stopped long enough for a brief statement. "Justice was served today, not just for me, but for everyone who's been told they're not good enough, smart enough, or important enough to matter. This victory belongs to a young woman who refused to be silenced, and a mother who taught her that integrity is worth more than comfort. Thank you." That night should have been celebratory, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Preston had been too quiet at the verdict, too controlled. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully. They struck back. His instinct proved correct. At 2 a.m, Richard's phone rang. Jennifer's voice was tight with urgency. "Richard, there's been an incident. Someone tried to break into Amara Technologies' office. The security system triggered. Police responded, but whoever it was got away." Richard was dressed and out the door in minutes. He arrived at their office to find police vehicles blocking the street, their lights painting the building and alternating red and blue. Inside, files had been scattered, computers overturned, server cables ripped out. It was a message, not a robbery. Zuri stood in the center of the chaos, her laptop clutched to her chest, her face pale but determined. Amara held her daughter's shoulders, her expression fierce with protective anger. "They were looking for the evidence backups," Zuri said when Richard approached. "They smashed the main servers, but they didn't find what they were looking for." "Because you moved it," Richard guessed. "Because I always have backups of backups. 3 encrypted drives in 3 different locations, all uploaded to secure cloud storage with redundant fail-safes." She managed a weak smile. "You can't be paranoid when it turns out they really are after you." Detective Maria Williams, no relation to Amara and Zuri, despite the shared surname, took their statements. "We've got footage of 2 men fleeing the scene. Masks, gloves, professionals. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone hired them." "Preston Hale," Richard said. "We can't prove that yet," the detective cautioned. "But given the timing right after the verdict, we're definitely looking at him closely. His electronic monitoring shows he was home all night, but that doesn't mean he couldn't have arranged it." "What do we do?" Amara asked. "You stay vigilant. We'll increase patrols in this area, and I'd recommend private security for all 3 of you until we make arrests." After the police left, Richard, Zuri, and Amara sat in the damaged office, too wired to sleep. The sun was starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. "He won't stop," Zuri said quietly. "The verdict didn't change anything. He'll keep coming after us. Then we make sure everyone knows he's coming," Richard replied. He pulled out his phone and composed a message to every media contact he had. Within an hour, the story was breaking on news sites across the country. Convicted saboteur strikes. Back office break-in following guilty verdict. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with support for Amara Technologies and calls for Preston's immediate arrest. By noon, the FBI had opened an investigation into witness intimidation and potential conspiracy to commit further crimes. Preston's lawyers issued a statement denying all involvement, but the damage was done. Investors abandoned him. His remaining business partners cut ties. The companies that had purchased stolen technology from him faced their own investigations. That evening, as Richard helped Zuri and Amara clean up the office, his phone rang with an unknown number. "Montgomery," he answered. You've destroyed me. Preston's voice was barely recognizable. Raw, broken, desperate. Everything I built, everything I worked for, gone. You destroyed yourself, Preston. I just made sure everyone could see what you really were. I gave you everything. I made you successful. Without me, you'd still be hustling small contracts. Without you, I'd still have my integrity, Richard said quietly. We could have built something great together. Instead, you chose betrayal. Don't lecture me about morality. You were just as ruthless as I am. The only difference is you got caught. No, Richard corrected. The difference is I learned something from falling. You're still blaming everyone but yourself. There was a long silence. Then Preston laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor. You think you've won? This isn't over. I still have connections, resources, options you can't imagine. Then use them to become a better person, Richard said. Because if you keep fighting, you'll lose everything you have left. He hung up before Preston could respond. Was that him? Zuri asked. Yes. What did he say? Richard looked at the two women who'd saved him from his own arrogance and gave him a chance at redemption. Nothing worth repeating. Let's focus on rebuilding. That's the best revenge. Not destroying him, but building something so good that his downfall becomes irrelevant. Over the next 2 weeks, they repaired the office, upgraded their security, and threw themselves into work. The story of their victory had spread, bringing attention and opportunities they hadn't anticipated. Universities invited Zuri to speak about cybersecurity. Investors offered funding with no strings attached. Former Montgomery Innovations employees who'd been scattered after the crash reached out asking to join the team. But the most meaningful moment came when Amara's name was officially added to the company charter as co-founder. Jennifer presented them with the legal documents during a small ceremony in their repaired office. Amara Technologies is now officially recognized as a company founded by Richard Montgomery, Zori Williams, and Amara Williams. Jennifer announced equal ownership, equal authority, equal everything. Amara held the document with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. I cleaned floors my whole life. I never thought you did more than clean floors, Mom, Zuri said, hugging her. You raised me. You taught me about dignity and strength. You gave Mr. Montgomery a place to rebuild. If anyone deserves to have their name on this company, it's you. Richard nodded. This company exists because of your kindness, Amara. We're just making sure the world knows it. As they stood together in their modest office, surrounded by the people they'd chosen to trust, Richard felt something he'd never experienced at the peak of his former empire. Peace. Not the peace of having no problems, but the peace of knowing he was finally building something that mattered. Preston could threaten all he wanted, but they'd already won the fight that mattered. The fight for integrity, for justice, and for proving that real power doesn't come from crushing others. It comes from lifting them up. 6 months after the trial, Richard stood before the modest building that would become the permanent home of Amara Technologies. It wasn't a gleaming skyscraper or a campus of modern glass structures. It was a refurbished community center in a neighborhood that had seen better days, surrounded by small businesses and residential blocks where families actually lived. The building had character. Exposed brick walls, high ceilings with original wooden beams, and large windows that let in natural light. What do you think? Zuri asked, appearing beside him with blueprints rolled under her arm. I think it's perfect, Richard said honestly. It feels real. The renovation had been a community effort. Local contractors worked alongside their new employees, teaching job skills to young people from the neighborhood. Amara had insisted on hiring a diverse team, prioritizing talent and potential over pedigree and connections. The result was a workspace that felt alive, vibrant with voices and perspectives that Richard's old company had never included. The grand opening drew a crowd that surprised even Richard. Former employees came, curious investors attended, and journalists documented every moment. But the most important guests were the 50 young people from underprivileged backgrounds who'd received scholarships from the fund Richard had established with his court-awarded damages. Zuri stood at the podium looking both nervous and radiant in a simple gray suit. The crowd quieted as she began to speak. 6 months ago, I was a community college student working part-time at a coffee shop, helping my mom make rent. Today, I'm standing here as CEO of a technology company that's redefining what ethical innovation looks like. She paused, letting the weight of that transformation settle over the audience. But this isn't really my story. It's ours. All of us who've been told we're not enough, not smart enough, not credentialed enough, not connected enough. This company exists to prove that talent doesn't come from privilege. It comes from opportunity. She gestured to the scholarship recipients in the front rows. These 50 students represent everything Amara Technologies believes in. They're brilliant minds who deserve a chance to show the world what they can do. Our scholarship program will cover their full tuition, provide mentorship, and guarantee internships here. Because we're not just building a company, we're building a pipeline for the next generation of innovators who might otherwise be overlooked. The applause was thunderous. Richard watched from the side of the stage, pride swelling in his chest. This remarkable young woman who'd once nervously offered to look at his broken computer was now commanding a room full of powerful people with grace and authority. Amara spoke next, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. I've spent most of my life being invisible, cleaning offices after everyone went home, picking up after people who never learned my name, working hard at jobs that society treats as disposable. But my daughter saw me. She saw my worth even when the world didn't. And now having my name on this building, on this company, it's not about ego or recognition. It's about remembering that every person has value regardless of what job they do or how much money they make. She looked directly at Richard. This company is named Amara Technologies, not because of me, but because of what the name represents: dignity, respect, the belief that everyone deserves to be seen. If we can build a successful business while treating every person with that same dignity, then we'll have accomplished something worth far more than profit. When Richard took the podium, he spoke without notes from a place of hard-earned humility. I built my first company on ambition and ego. I measured success in dollars and square footage. I hired people based on their resumes and fired them based on quarterly numbers. And I lost everything because I forgot the most important truth. Businesses don't succeed because of brilliant CEOs. They succeed because of talented people working together towards something meaningful. He gestured to Zuri and Amara. These two women saved me from my own arrogance. They taught me that real leadership means service, not authority. That innovation comes from diverse perspectives, not homogeneous boardrooms. That profit should be the result of doing good work, not the only goal that matters. Amara Technologies will succeed or fail based on whether we honor those principles, and I promise you, we will honor them. The crowd rose to their feet. Cameras flashed. Journalists scribbled notes. But Richard only saw the faces of the scholarship recipients, young people who reminded him of Zuri, brilliant, hungry, deserving of a chance they might never have gotten otherwise. After the ceremony, as people mingled in the newly renovated space, Richard found himself approached by a young woman who looked vaguely familiar. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm Emma Bradford. I used to work in your legal department at Montgomery. Innovations." Richard searched his memory and came up empty. "I'm sorry. You wouldn't remember me. I was pretty junior, just out of law school, but I remember you." She smiled slightly. "You walked past my desk every day for 2 years and never once acknowledged me. When I tried to bring concerns about contract irregularities to your attention, your assistant told me you didn't have time for entry-level observations." Richard felt shame over him. "I'm sorry I was an arrogant jerk," Emma finished, but her tone was gentle, not accusatory. "Yeah, but so was I. Honestly, I thought success meant clawing my way up, stepping on whoever I needed to step on. I left corporate law after the trial, went to work for a nonprofit doing civil rights litigation. I make 1/3 of what I used to, but I actually sleep at night." "What made you come today?" Richard asked. "Curiosity, mostly. I wanted to see if you'd really changed or if this was just good PR." She looked around at the diverse crowd, the scholarship students, the community members. "Turns out you really did change. That gives me hope that change is possible for the rest of us, too." Similar conversations happened throughout the evening. Former employees shared stories of how Richard's transformation had inspired their own reevaluation of success and purpose. Investors talked about shifting their portfolios toward ethical companies. Students spoke about their dreams with a confidence that came from finally being believed in. As the crowd thinned and evening shadows stretched across the polished floors, Richard found Zuri in her new office, a modest space with a simple desk and walls lined with whiteboards covered in code and diagrams. "You did good today," he said from the doorway. "We did good," she corrected, not looking up from her laptop. "This is all of ours. What are you working on?" "The next version of the algorithm. I'm trying to build in even better ethical safeguards. If we're going to license this to other companies, I want to make absolutely sure it can't be used for predatory practices." Richard sat in the chair across from her desk. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were just a kid who happened to know some coding. I had no idea I was looking at someone who'd revolutionize how I thought about everything." Zuri finally looked up, a slight smile on her face. "And when I first met you, I thought you were an entitled billionaire who got what he deserved. Turns out we were both wrong about each other. Maybe that's the lesson in all this. We're all wrong about each other until we actually take the time to look." The first year of Amara Technologies was a whirlwind. They launched their ethical AI algorithm to significant market interest, licensing it to companies that passed their rigorous vetting process. Several major tech firms failed the vetting. Zuri refused to compromise on her standards, even when turning down lucrative deals. "We could have made $3 million from that contract," one of their financial advisors argued during a board meeting. "And compromised everything we stand for," Zuri countered. "That company has a documented history of exploiting user data. I don't care how much money they're offering. We're not helping them do it more efficiently." Richard backed her completely. "Zuri's right. We turn down any deal that contradicts our values regardless of the price." Some investors grumbled, but others appreciated the consistency. Slowly, Amara Technologies built a reputation as a company that actually meant what it said. Their profits were modest compared to industry giants, but they were sustainable and clean. The scholarship program that Zuri and Amara had once dreamed about as a fragile pilot for just 50 students refused to stay small. Within 2 years, it had grown into a lifeline for more than 200 young people from underserved communities, offering far more than a tuition check. These students received long-term mentorship, structured internships, career guidance, and most importantly, a visible bridge from no connections, no chances, to meaningful work in the world of technology. Zuri's own life expanded alongside it. The quiet community college student who'd once asked, "Can I take a look?" gradually became a name the tech world couldn't ignore. Universities, tech conferences, and leadership summits across the globe invited her to speak, and she stood on those stages talking not just about algorithms and architecture, but about ethical innovation, responsible AI, and why the people designing technology must reflect the diversity of those who live with its consequences. She never tried to polish away the reality of her beginnings. Instead, she put them right at the center of her story, proof that what most people called talent was usually just talent plus access, and that determination needed opportunity more than it needed pedigree. Amara, who had always been wary of attention and cameras, found her own kind of spotlight in the work she did on the ground. She became the heart of the company's community efforts, building partnerships with local schools, setting up job retraining programs for adults looking to pivot into tech, and making sure Amara Technologies never floated above the neighborhood like some distant corporation. "We don't just extract from this community," she told a local reporter during an interview. "We invest in it. These people are our neighbors. Their wins are our wins too." It wasn't a slogan. It was how she made every decision. Richard's place in this new world changed more quietly, but just as profoundly. He still handled operations, managed investor relationships, and navigated the complex legal and financial structures that kept the company alive, but he no longer stood at the top as the unchallenged voice in the room. Instead, he became a facilitator, someone who cleared obstacles, connected the right people, and made sure the spotlight fell on Zuri and Amara when it mattered. It was, to his surprise, a harder way to work than ruling by decree had ever been. True collaboration meant compromise, patience, and listening, but it also brought a fulfillment his old empire had never given him. 3 years after Preston's trial, an invitation arrived that made Richard pause. Stanford's business school, where he'd once strutted through hallways preaching a gospel of domination and profit, wanted him back as a guest speaker. Standing at the front of that lecture hall again, facing a room full of future executives, he couldn't bring himself to tell the old story. "The last time I spoke here," he began, "I told you that success meant being the sharpest, the toughest, the one who never hesitated to squeeze the last drop out of every deal. I told you compassion was a liability, and that you should never let your feelings get in the way of profit." He let the silence stretch for a moment, then admitted, "I was wrong. About all of it." He spoke openly about the collapse of his company and his reputation, about Zuri and Amara, and about learning that real strength sometimes looks like saying, "I don't know," and real intelligence often shows up as recognizing someone else's brilliance. "The company I help run now brings in only a fraction of what my old one did," he told them, "but it creates more real value than anything I've ever built. We hire people who deserve chances, not just those who already have them. We build technology that tries to make society more just, not just more efficient. We measure success in lives changed, not just in quarterly returns." A student asked the question his younger self might have asked. Wasn't all of that hopelessly idealistic, especially in a world where companies without those constraints would surely outpace them? "We compete by changing the definition of winning," Richard replied. "We're not trying to crush other companies or swallow entire markets. We're trying to prove that ethical business is sustainable business. Investors are beginning to care where their money goes. Customers are starting to care who they support. The rules are shifting. The only real choice you have is whether you cling to the old game or help write the new one." Another student pushed further, asking what they did when ethics and profit conflicted. "We choose ethics," he said without flinching. "And the surprising thing is that over time that choice usually pays off. Integrity attracts loyal customers, committed employees, and patient investors. Exploitation might bring fast growth, but it rarely lasts. We're not racing, we're building." Meanwhile, Preston Hale's story took a very different turn. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for corporate sabotage, fraud, and theft of intellectual property. The court seized his assets to fund restitution for those he'd harmed, and the man who'd once called himself irreplaceable became a cautionary case study in business schools and leadership seminars. When Richard heard about the sentencing, he felt no sense of triumph, no satisfaction at seeing an enemy fall. What he felt was a quiet, heavy sadness for what had been wasted. 2 men who might have built something remarkable together, derailed by ego, insecurity, and greed. Some months later, a letter arrived from the federal facility where Preston was serving his term. It was handwritten, brief, and stripped of the bravado that had once defined him. He admitted that he'd justified his actions as ambition, as the necessary ruthlessness required to win, but that the truth underneath was fear of not being enough, of being exposed, of being discarded. So he'd struck first, destroying Richard before Richard could outgrow him. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he confessed. "I don't deserve it, but watching you rebuild with integrity has taught me more about leadership than I learned in 2 decades of business. You were always better than I allowed myself to see." Richard read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. Some answers, he realized, people had to find on their own. Redemption, like failure, couldn't be outsourced. By the 5-year mark after the trial, Amara Technologies had become a reference point in conversations about ethical tech. Their AI system, carefully monitored and continuously audited, had been licensed to dozens of companies that signed on to strict guidelines for responsible use. Their scholarship program had grown to support more than 500 students, boasting a 93% graduation rate and a 100% job placement rate. Zuri, at 25, was no longer a novelty to the media. She was recognized as a serious innovator, featured on the covers of major tech magazines, and invited to sit on panels with people twice her age. She turned down offers from Google, Microsoft, Apple, and several other giants. "Why would I leave what we've built?" she told Richard when he asked. "They want me to validate their image. Here, I help shape the reality." There's a big difference. Amara's impact radiated far beyond the company walls. The neighborhood around their headquarters, once written off as struggling, began to change. Long vacant storefronts filled with small businesses. Crime rates dropped as job opportunities increased. Property values stabilized without pushing residents out. City officials started referring to Amara Technologies as an anchor institution, a company that didn't just take resources from the community but also poured them back in, creating stability and hope. As Richard entered his early 60s, thoughts of legacy began to surface more often. Not legacy in the old sense, no more towers with his surname and no interest in Hall of Fame CEO status, but legacy measured in the people and principles that would outlive him. One evening, he, Zuri, and Amara sat on the rooftop of their building, watching the city fade into twilight with the familiar hum of traffic below. It had become something of a ritual, stepping away from the noise and pressure to ask themselves if they were still moving in the right direction. "I've been thinking about succession," Richard said, breaking the quiet. Zuri laughed and reminded him he was neither retired nor dying. He smiled but didn't back down. He didn't want the company's values to be fragile, dependent on whichever personality held the CEO title. He wanted something more structural, a kind of constitution for Amara Technologies that would legally bind the organization to its principles, even if leadership changed or the temptation to compromise grew stronger. Amara liked the idea immediately. "We didn't build this on one person's ego," she said. "We built it on shared values. Let's make that official." Over the next several weeks, working with lawyers and advisors, they drafted a formal charter. It committed the company to ethical practices, transparent operations, meaningful community investment, diverse hiring, and profit sharing with employees. The document was designed with safeguards that made it extremely hard for any future board to dismantle these commitments quietly. It wasn't a perfect shield. Nothing in business ever is. But it tilted the structure in favor of doing the right thing even when it might be inconvenient. The board adopted it unanimously, and for the first time, Richard felt that Amara Technologies could survive not only his mistakes, but his eventual absence. 7 years after his fall, Richard and Zuri were invited to speak at a global innovation summit in Singapore. The organizers didn't just want to talk about their tech. They specifically requested a joint appearance focused on how their unlikely partnership had reshaped both a company and 2 lives. Standing on a stage overlooking a sea of faces from governments, corporations, and nonprofits, Richard told only the opening chapter of their story and then stepped back, insisting that Zuri narrate the rest. "Once, someone told me I couldn't be of much help," she began, her voice steady but edged with wry humor. Richard heard the echo of that first night in his penthouse, when he'd looked at her and seen only the cleaner's daughter with a laptop, not the kid who would rewrite his future. "He was wrong about that," Zuri continued, "but he was right about one thing. I couldn't help him rebuild what he'd lost. What we did instead was build something different from scratch." She walked the audience through each chapter: the crash, the digital forensics, the trial, the founding of Amara Technologies, the difficulties of choosing ethics when shortcuts were available, the victories that came slowly but stuck. She spoke about what it meant to be a young Black woman from a working-class background in rooms dominated by people who had always been told they belonged there. She explained how those experiences gave her insights into blind spots the industry kept repeating. "Innovation doesn't happen when everyone in the room shares the same story," she said. "It happens when people with different histories and scars and perspectives collide and are brave enough to question each other." Richard had to lose everything before he could see that. "My hope is that some of you can learn that lesson without having to crash first." When she finished, the audience rose in a standing ovation that went on long enough to feel almost surreal. Richard stood too, applauding her as fiercely as anyone, knowing that whatever credit people tried to give him, she was the one who had pulled them all into a better direction. Afterward, representatives from massive corporations and government agencies flocked to them, asking how they could replicate this model. Richard and Zuri explained over and over that there was no plug-and-play template for what they'd done. There was only a series of choices, to value people over image, long-term impact over short-term gains, and truth over comfort. Doesn't that limit your growth? One executive asked. It limits certain kinds of growth, Zuri answered calmly. We'll never be the biggest or the fastest, but we'll be steady, honest, and useful. For us, that trade is worth it. On the flight home, with the cabin lights dimmed and clouds stretching like an endless sea beneath them, Richard found himself staring out the window, thinking about branching timelines and second chances. "What's going on in there?" Zuri asked from the next seat. He told her that if someone offered to rewind time, erase the crash, erase Preston's betrayal, let him keep the old company intact, he would refuse. She raised an eyebrow, skeptical, until he explained. Without the collapse, he would never have met her, never have partnered with her mother, and never have been forced to confront just how hollow his old definition of success had been. "I'd rather be the man I am now," he said quietly, "even with the scars, than the man I was then with all the money." Zuri smiled and called it real growth, the kind you couldn't capture in a spreadsheet. 10 years after the trial, they celebrated a decade of Amara Technologies with a ceremony at their now expanded headquarters. The building had grown into a campus that included an innovation lab, a community education center, and offices for over 300 employees. The scholarship program had supported more than 1,000 students by then, and nearly half of the company's workforce had come through that pipeline. They had launched similar programs in 5 other cities, creating a small network of companies guided by the same charter. At the anniversary event, Amara spoke first. Dressed simply, as she always preferred, she stood at the podium looking out at employees, scholarship graduates, community partners, and their families. 10 years ago, she said, I was a cleaning lady whose biggest dream was to see her child finish college without drowning in debt. Today I stand here as co-founder of a company that has changed more lives than I can count. Not because I'm special, but because kindness and courage collided at the right moment. She glanced at Zuri and Richard, her eyes shining. My daughter's brilliance and a man's willingness to change gave us this. The rest came from all of you. Richard spoke last. His hair had turned fully white by then, and the lines on his face told their own story. But his posture carried an ease that had never existed in his boardroom days. When people talk about my legacy, he began, they expect me to point at this building, this company, these programs. They're important. I'm proud of them, but they are not my legacy. He turned toward Zuri. She is. Zuri didn't just help save a ruined company. She saved me from spending the rest of my life angry at the world and convinced that my worst choices were all I would ever be remembered for. He addressed the crowd one last time. If there's one lesson you carry away from our story, let it be this. The person who changes your life might be someone you barely see, someone you dismiss, underestimate, or ignore. Stay humble enough to recognize brilliance in unexpected places. Stay open enough to accept help from people you once thought beneath your notice. And stay grateful enough to honor those who believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself. Later that evening, Richard slipped away for a few minutes to the rooftop where so many of their turning points had quietly begun. The city glowed below, familiar and new all at once. Zuri found him there with 2 cups of coffee and a knowing smile. "Avoiding your own party?" she teased. "Just thinking," he replied, "about how I almost missed all of this." She suggested, half joking, that they should write a book. When he asked what they'd call it, she didn't need to think long. She remembered the first night she'd walked into his shattered penthouse and offered the simplest of lifelines. "Maybe we call it Can I Take a Look?" she said. "Because that's where everything really started." Richard laughed, a sound that held no trace of bitterness anymore. "Perfect," he agreed. "One question changed everything. I just had to be broken enough to say yes." They stood together, watching lights flicker on across the city. Inside the building beneath them, employees finished projects, students attended evening classes, and neighbors gathered in community spaces funded by a company that had chosen principles over shortcuts. "You know what I keep coming back to?" Richard asked quietly. "What?" Zuri replied. "None of this exists because of my money or my old reputation. It exists because your mother showed compassion to a man who had lost everything, And you had the courage to help someone who hadn't done a thing to deserve your trust. Every good thing in my life now can be traced back to kindness I didn't earn. You earned it later, Zuri said softly. By being honest, by staying humble, by changing. Anyone can fall. Not everyone gets back up as a different person. You did. As they headed downstairs to rejoin the celebration, Richard thought about the fork where his life had split. One path had led to isolation, bitterness, and the slow suffocation of a man who never admitted he'd been wrong. The other path led here, to this rooftop, this company, these people, this peace. The difference between those paths hadn't been a business strategy or a clever plan. It had been one small question from a young woman who chose to see possibility where he saw only ruin. Can I take a look? He had laughed at her then. Sure, she had nothing to offer. He'd been wrong. Spectacularly, mercifully wrong. Being wrong forced him to confront truth. Losing what he'd worshipped forced him to discover what actually mattered. In the end, that loss was the doorway to everything he now cherished. Back downstairs, surrounded by laughter, clinking glasses, and the buzz of a future being built in real time, Richard raised his drink. To second chances, he said, to unexpected teachers, and to the people brave enough to say, "Can I take a look?" when everyone else has already given up. The room answered with cheers. Amara and Zuri stood on either side of him, three unlikely partners bound not by blood or contracts, but by choice, grace, and hard-earned change. What started as a story about a fall ended as a story about a foundation, not of glass and steel, but of values and partnership designed to outlast all three of them. If you lost everything tomorrow, would you have the humility to accept help from the very people you've spent your life overlooking? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories about redemption, justice, and the unexpected heroes who change everything when no one is watching.